as we were sitting tonight, I wonder how many of us were waiting for the bell. And I don't mean that as a criticism. Just honestly, how many of us were waiting for the bell? Maybe not impatiently, maybe not desperately, but with that question in the back of our minds, or just at the edge of our peripheral vision, how many minutes left? When will it come? When do we do the next part? I suspect most of us. And then I wonder, of those of us who had that question, who felt that sense of waiting, how many of us, for even just for a moment, didn't feel it? Felt no concern about what was going to happen next. Felt no concern about how long we had left. Think about that. What was your ratio? On Friday, I heard that Sojun Mel Weitsman, he was the abbot of the Berkeley Zen Center, had passed away. He was 91 years old, and he had been sick for a long time. There was no surprise, and yet, hearing the news, it's different. You process that someone is going to pass away, but then when it's real, it hits you in a different way. And I think it hit much of the Zen world in the same way. There's a shockwave that happens. Here's someone who dedicated his life to practice and did so in a way that I think is rare. It was unpretentious. Was without, as far as I could see, any interest in self-promotion, any interest in becoming a brand. He had a community, and he sat with his community. He guided his community, and that was all. He did it for decades. He left behind a legacy of students who had that same solidity. It's an incredible contribution. So, in the hours and days after his passing, of course, there was a lot of talk about him, and on these email lists I belong to, where Zen teachers are talking to each other, people are sharing their stories and their sadness. And one priest who had never met him mentioned that he had heard a talk by Sojun Weitzman in which he said something that then stuck with him forever. And here it was. It was, true patience is not waiting for something. True patience is not waiting for something. And I saw this go by, and just like the person who had posted it, I found that an hour later I was still thinking about it, and a day later I was still thinking about it, and today I'm still thinking about it. And so I wanted to share this with you. Just before this talk, I went and I looked up patience. I wanted to know the etymology. Sometimes that's kind of too clever, but I was curious. And what I found was that patience finds its origins in the Latin word for suffering. And I immediately imagined, this is suffering in the sense of, when we use suffering as in a transitive way, like, he doesn't suffer fools. When we say he doesn't suffer fools, we mean he has no patience for fools. Right? He doesn't allot his suffering to those kinds of people. He suffers for something else. Something else is worth it. How good are we at that kind of suffering? And what does it mean? There's a word in Japanese, gaman. And in the prefecture where I lived in Japan, Kumamoto, there was a particular fondness or love for this word gaman. Gaman has this notion, it has this feeling of patience as suffering. It's to endure in a stoic way. So people in Kumamoto will proudly say that children who are raised in Kumamoto are gaman tsuyoi. Tsuyoi is strong. Right? They're good at this. They're good at this stoic endurance. This ability to just take it. That kind of suffering is, I think, a virtue. For those who have it, for those who have patience, who have the ability to deal with a situation even though it is not the situation they want, have a kind of gift. Their life is a little bit easier. There's less resistance for them. It's worth cultivating, it's worth examining this idea of gaman, this root idea of patience. But what Sojun Weitsman is talking about here is something else. Not suffering as a skill, but patience as a quality. Something beneath it. I consider myself, in cases that don't involve my children, to be a fairly patient person. I'm really good at the layover that gets extended and extended and extended. I don't get riled up. It's okay. But it's not because I lose sight of what I'm waiting for. That's a kind of suffering that I'm not too bad at. And maybe it comes from being in a monastery where there's a lot of endurance. Maybe it's just something I get better at with age. Maybe it's just temperament. I can wait certain things out, but it doesn't mean that I'm not waiting. It doesn't mean I'm not watching the clock. Beneath this question of true patience is another question, a more personal question of what are you waiting for? What do you think will come? Or what do you think must come? What's around the bend? I look forward to this year, to 2021, and I look back to next week, everything that's happening in the world, and I see that I'm waiting for a lot of things. I'm waiting for certain things to change. I'm waiting for there to be certain actions, for there to be certain consequences. I'm waiting for there to be new opportunities. I'm waiting for a shift. And until those things happen, there is a feeling that things are not quite right. Right? I'll get through today. Just like I'm sitting in an airport, waiting for that announcement that my plane is finally ready to board. But I'm getting through it because I believe that that will happen. Because there's something that happens next. What are you waiting for? Most of us, on a base level, are waiting for conditions to change. Whether we mean that politically or personally or financially, there's a belief that right now we're on our way to something else. I don't mean that necessarily optimistically. It's not that we believe things will get better. It's that where we are now isn't where we're going to end up. And where we're going to end up is the thing that matters. Good or bad. We're on a trajectory. There's something that's going to happen next. And we go through our lives, some of us good at that kind of waiting, and some of us not so good. Some of us suffer more or suffer worse. Some of us suffer better. But it's still a kind of suffering. Feeling that the real thing is ahead. That this is a station between past and future. When Sojun Weitsman says, true patience is not waiting for something, the way that I understand that is that there's an entirely different way to be patient. One in which, yes, we may know that something is coming, but we're not concerned. Because we're here. Because we know that we will always be here. Because we know that there will never be anything more real than this. Now. And I asked at the beginning because I think most of you have experienced this in sitting. It's not magical. It's not mystical. It's not something you write a spiritual book about. It's so simple. You're sitting and you're breathing. And some part of you is wondering when he's going to ring the bell. And then somehow you settle in. Maybe just for a few breaths. And now you're not thinking about the bell. Not because you've distracted yourself with something else, but because this is sufficient. Because this is real. You show up for that. And then something happens. And you remember the bell. You go back to waiting. My point is, I think we all know what it means to experience this true patience. It's one thing to experience it sitting and breathing in this kind of quiet space. It's another, or it feels like another, to to experience it in your life. And so in honor of Sojun Weitzman, who really was remarkable, I want to offer an invitation today. One that I think he was putting forward as well. To take up the possibility that you are not on your way to anything. To take up the possibility that no train is coming. To take up the possibility that you are not between this and this. But that for all practical purposes, this is it. To take up the possibility that there cannot be more than this, because this is the only place where you are. That you are not on a trajectory. That you are not part of a chapter in the middle of the book. That the story of your life is the story of what's happening to you right now, in this moment. To take up the possibility that this is enough. I'll stop there.